So let's talk about Marilyn Monroe, possibly the most recognizable sex symbol of the 20th century, maybe of all time really. The original blonde bombshell, all due respect to Mae West and Jean Harlow. Look, her life has been poured over 1,000,000 times. Books, articles, movies, YouTube videos, everything in between, you name it. We seem to know everything about her tragic life. But is it possible that there's something that we don't know about her that hasn't been dissected from every conceivable angle? Well, it turns out the answer is yes. There's a 2-year window in her life that has gone mostly unnoticed, or at least undernoticed, and in my mind is truly fascinating. Now, did you know that Marilyn Monroe was discovered because there was a search for the next Rosie the Riveter? You know, the famous World War II icon on the poster? That she was working in a factory that made components for the war effort when she was discovered. Well, it really happened. And there's an unbelievable coincidence you have to stay around to the end. This is the true story of Marilyn Monroe. Hi, I'm Nick Ragone with This Date in History. So we actually touched upon this in a short video a couple of months ago that we did. It's actually one of our most popular videos. I'll leave a link to it in the description box if you want to watch it. But funnily enough, when we created the video, my brother Tom and I, we held it for a few months because we weren't sure it would actually resonate with our audience. You know, it's not really our typical fare of American exceptionalism, and at best, it's kind of obliquely related to World War II. But as it turned out, it really resonated with all of you. And I think it's because it's interesting and it's pretty unknown, at least in my mind. Look, I'm an industrial grade history nerd, and I had no idea that she played even a small role in the war effort or how she was actually discovered. So let me set this up. This isn't a long video, but there's some twists and some turns, so you gotta hang with me. And I promise the ending will be worth it, just trust me. So all of you know, or at least most of you know, Marilyn was actually born Norma Jean Mortensen. Now I'll confess, I knew her first name was Norma Jean, I think we all know that, but I always thought her birth surname was either Baker or Doherty. I hadn't realized that her birth surname was actually Mortensen. I'm guessing I'm not the only one who didn't know that, by the way. Now this is where it gets complicated, so like I said, hang with me a little bit. So it turns out that her mother, Gladys Baker, had 2 children with her first husband, an abusive man named John Baker. It's a tumultuous relationship, to say the least. I won't bore you with the details, you could Google it, but she ends up leaving him and she gets a job at a movie studio cutting film negatives. She meets a businessman named Martin Mortensen. Guy sounds like a Marvel Comics protagonist, Martin Mortensen, and they're married in 1924. Now their marriage only lasts a couple of months, but during that time, she becomes pregnant with Norma Jean. Now for the longest time, like till 2022, it was always believed that Martin Mortensen was Marilyn Monroe's biological father. After all, his name was on the birth certificate. But in 2022, DNA testing proved that it was a co-worker of Gladys's, a guy named Charles Stanley Gifford, who was actually Marilyn Monroe's biological father. It turns out that Gladys had a brief fling with this guy Charles Gifford, and that he was Marilyn's father. Now this had been speculated for a long time, even during Marilyn's lifetime, but it wasn't actually confirmed until 2022. I didn't know that, and I find that amazing. I'm not sure how many of you knew that. Leave it in the comments if you did. So evidently for years, Marilyn's mother Gladys told her that somebody famous, like a movie star, was her father. But at some point, she breaks the news to young Norma Jean that it's actually this co-worker at the movie studio, Charles Gifford, who's her biological father. Now keep in mind, Gladys Baker is in and out of institutions her entire adult life, and she suffers from pretty severe mental health issues. So trying to nail down every detail about Norma Jean / Marilyn gets really complicated. By the way, there's also evidence that Marilyn tried to make contact with Charles Gifford on multiple occasions throughout the 1950s when she's already a big celebrity, with no success. It was reported somewhere that in their only conversation, he told her he wanted nothing to do with her and that she should get a lawyer. I mean, heartbreaking stuff. I'm sure this rejection wreaked havoc on Marilyn's very fragile psyche, and God only knows how it contributed to her downward spiral through the years. Okay, so back to the story. It's clear that Gladys Baker wasn't financially or mentally prepared to have a child, and so it's not surprising that Norma Jean's childhood is pretty chaotic, to say the least. They sort of bounce around here and there until Norma Jean turns 7, at which time Gladys has a full mental breakdown and is institutionalized. She pretty much spends the rest of her life in various hospitals and institutions, and she and Marilyn would have very little contact. Like I said, it's a pretty heartbreaking relationship between the two of them. At this point, Norma Jean becomes a ward of the state, and she sort of bounces back and forth between orphanages, foster care, and brief stints with family friends. The formerly outgoing young girl becomes withdrawn, she develops a stutter, and is likely physically abused on multiple occasions. I read a quote somewhere that Marilyn gave years later, saying that the only escape she had during this period of her life was going to the movies from dawn to dusk and imagining herself in kind of a fantasy land of make-believe. It's there that she decides she is going to be a movie star. You could almost picture this little girl sitting alone in the front of the movie theater, staring up at the giant screen, daydreaming about a better life. It's kind of poignant and sad at the same time. So it's 1941. Marilyn's 15 now, Norma Jean still, and she finally enjoys some relative stability in her life. She attends Van Nuys High School in Los Angeles, a pretty famous school. In fact, one of her classmates is actually Jane Russell. And she's out of the orphanage system and back living with some family friends. Now, it's at this point when the family she's living with decides they're going to relocate to West Virginia for work, and Marilyn is confronted with the reality of going back into the orphanage system, which she desperately wants to avoid. So her solution? She decides to marry her neighbor's son, a 21-year-old factory worker named James Doherty. As soon as she turns 16, they get married so that she could stay out of the orphanage system. Now, this is a key point because a lot of the questions in our short video, and I mean a lot, was about her first husband, this guy James Doherty, and how she jilted him, whatever became of him, and so forth. Well, the truth is, this is really a marriage of convenience more than anything else. Look, whether or not they were in love or they planned on staying together forever, it's hard to say. There's nothing sure about Norma Jean / Marilyn. But it's clear that she married him to avoid going back into the orphanage system, and probably to have a roof over her head, quite frankly. It certainly wasn't the type of fairy tale romance, one of those World War II romances that we've done a lot of videos on that you seem to like, these kind of inspirational, poignant romances. It wasn't one of those. This is Norma Jean, soon to be Marilyn, just trying to survive. So she drops out of high school, she gets married, and she becomes a housewife, and she's 16. So here's really the critical juncture of the story, the whole point of making this video. So shortly after they're married, Jim Doherty enlists in the Merchant Marine, and he's shipped off to the Pacific, where he'd spend the remainder of the war. At this point, Norma Jean moves in with her in-laws and decides to get a job, mostly out of sheer boredom, but it's also been noted in various biographies of hers because she wanted to do her patriotic duty, which I think is pretty cool. She probably also wanted some spending money too, that's sure. So she gets a job at the Radioplane Company in Burbank, California, founded by a British character actor named Reginald Denny, of all people. They make small remote-controlled aircraft that the Army and the Navy anti-aircraft gunners use for target practice to refine their skills. It's actually pretty cool stuff when you think about it. Who knew that drones played a role in World War II? Some pretty sophisticated and advanced technology for the day. All in all, pretty cutting-edge stuff. And there's a young Norma Jean, soon to be Marilyn Monroe, working in the factory on the assembly line. And you can't make this stuff up. You can only imagine that a 17-year-old Norma Jean is really popular at the factory, or at least attention-getting, even if it is before the bleached hair, the cap teeth, and the nose job. Sure enough, she wins a $50 war bond for being elected Queen of the Company Picnic. That might not seem like a lot, but back then I'm sure it was. But more importantly, it makes her a pseudo-celebrity at the plant, and this is where fate rears its head. So remember I told you that a character actor named Reginald Denny owned the plant. Well, it turns out that Denny was good friends with a guy named Ronald Reagan, who at the time was Captain Ronald Reagan, the commanding officer of the Army's first motion picture unit, which was tasked with making training films and promoting war bond tours and the like. Reagan, it turns out, was looking for a new, fresh-faced Rosie the Riveter type that he could use to promote the war effort on the home front, and he assigned an Army photographer, a guy named David Conover, to go to the Radio Plan factory and get some good pictures. It's been said that Denny told Reagan that he had a fresh-faced beauty that might fit the bill. Can you imagine that? I mean, just serendipity. Well, the rest of the story is history. Upon getting to the factory, Conover is immediately taken with Norma Jean. She just stands out from everybody else. He asks if she'll pose for a few shots, and in his words, she came alive with such sure and immediate instincts that he could barely hold the camera from shaking. Conover couldn't believe at how natural and comfortable she was in front of the camera, and recalled that the only thing she said to him throughout the shoot was, "Am I really photogenic?" Which you could almost hear in that kind of soft whisper of a voice that she had. So anyway, the pictures themselves weren't extensively used for the Army promotions, but over the next few months, Conover would continue to photograph her, creating a photographic portfolio for Norma Jean that allowed her to break into professional modeling. In January 1945, Norma Jean, almost Marilyn now, not quite, calls it quits at the factory and decides to become a full-time model, much to the ire of her in-laws and Jimmy Doherty, who are dead set against it. She finds steady work as a print model, and the pay is pretty good, so much so that she could support herself. In late 1945, after the war is over, Jimmy is back stateside on 2-week leave, and he gives Norma Jean an ultimatum: either marriage or modeling. And of course, we know that she chooses modeling, and he receives the actual divorce papers while back in the South China Sea on assignment in the spring of 1946. I point out the timing because she didn't actually divorce him while the war was still going on. Not that that really matters all that much, but that was a frequent question of ours in a short video. Did she dump the guy while he was fighting in the Pacific? And the answer is no. It's actually been well documented that she wanted to make the marriage work, but giving up on modeling was non-negotiable. So it wasn't just a clear case of her dumping him and moving on. Like everything else with her life, it's just complicated. The other most frequent question we get is whatever happened to Jimmy Doherty? So a year after the divorce with Norma Jean, he gets remarried and he'd go on to have 3 children of his own. He also had a long and productive career with the LAPD as a detective, where he helped create the Special Weapons and Tactics Group. And he also broke a plot to kidnap the actor and Korean War hero James Garner, believe it or not. I'm not sure if that was an episode of the Rockford Files, but it should have been. He and Marilyn would never see each other again after the divorce. In fact, Doherty claimed to never have watched any of her movies, and the first time he ever spoke publicly about her was when the Associated Press called him to inform him of Marilyn's death. He'd go on to write 2 memoirs about their time together, and even filmed a documentary shortly before his death in 2005. Look, I could talk endlessly about Marilyn Monroe. She's like a Shakespearean tragedy come to life. But alas, we're going to end it here. So next time you're watching Some Like It Hot or Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, just remember that Marilyn, young Norma Jean, she did her part in the war effort, she was discovered inadvertently by Ronald Reagan, and it launched her amazing career. It really happened. Till next time, I'm Nick Ragone.